Sometimes the person you tried the hardest to forget is the one you're least prepared to see again. The hospital was unusually quiet for 2 in the morning, the kind of quiet that hummed beneath fluorescent lights and echoed softly along polished floors. Ethan Parker moved quickly down the long corridor of Westbridge Medical Center, the sound of his dress shoes tapping against the tile the only rhythm in the empty hallway. 10 minutes earlier his phone had lit up with a call no son ever wanted in the middle of the night. His mother had been rushed in after a sudden medical complication, and every mile of the drive across Boston had felt longer than the last. The faint smell of antiseptic hung in the air, blending with the sterile brightness of the hospital's overhead lights. Nurses moved quietly behind the main desk, their voices low and professional, while a heart monitor somewhere down the hall beeped in a slow, steady pattern that sounded almost like a distant metronome. Ethan had walked through boardrooms filled with billion-dollar negotiations without his pulse changing once. But tonight his chest felt tight, his breath shallow as he followed the signs toward the ICU wing. The Parker name opened many doors in this city, but at this hour it didn't make the walk any easier. A nurse pointed him toward a set of glass doors at the end of the corridor. "Family members can wait just outside the intensive care unit," she said gently. Ethan nodded, barely hearing her, and continued forward. The lights above him buzzed softly, reflecting off the spotless floors. For a moment the hallway felt strangely endless, like one of those dreams where the destination keeps moving further away no matter how fast you walk. Then the ICU doors opened. And that was when Ethan Parker stopped. Completely. The world seemed to narrow to a single point at the far end of the hallway where a woman stood beneath the white glow of the ceiling lights, reviewing a patient chart on a clipboard. She wore navy blue medical scrubs, her dark hair pulled neatly back, the calm posture of someone used to long shifts and difficult nights. For a second Ethan didn't breathe. His mind insisted it had to be a coincidence, a trick of exhaustion and fluorescent lighting. But then she looked up. Claire Bennett. The name moved through his mind like a memory waking from a long sleep. It had been years since he had seen her, years since the night she had disappeared from his life without explanation, leaving behind nothing but unanswered questions and a silence that had followed him through every success afterward. Yet there she was, standing less than 20 feet away in the quiet hallway of a hospital he had never visited before tonight. Claire's eyes met his, and in that instant something unspoken passed between them, something fragile and complicated that time alone hadn't erased. She blinked once, the faintest flicker of surprise crossing her otherwise composed expression, but the professional calm returned almost immediately. Ethan remained frozen where he stood, his hand still resting against the glass door behind him, the cool surface pressing against his palm. For years he had imagined what it might feel like to see her again. He had pictured chance encounters in crowded restaurants, passing glances on city sidewalks, even awkward reunions at charity events. But he had never imagined this. Never imagined seeing her under the cold white lights of an ICU hallway at 2 in the morning while his mother fought for her health behind those doors. Claire stepped forward with the steady confidence of someone accustomed to difficult moments. When she spoke, her voice was calm, professional, and carefully neutral. "Mr. Parker," she said, glancing briefly at the chart in her hands before meeting his eyes again. "Your mother is stable for now. The doctors are continuing to monitor her condition." For a moment Ethan didn't respond. Not because he hadn't heard her, but because the sound of his own last name on her lips felt strangely unfamiliar after all this time. Once, years ago, she had never called him Parker. Back then, it had always been Ethan. The hallway felt colder after that moment, as if the fluorescent lights had grown sharper and the air inside the intensive care wing carried a weight that had not been there before. Ethan Parker finally forced himself to move, though each step toward Claire Bennett felt strangely heavy, like walking through a memory he had never truly escaped. The clipboard remained steady in her hands, her posture composed, professional, the same calm presence that must have reassured countless families standing exactly where he stood now. Yet Ethan knew the woman in front of him had once been something entirely different in his life. She had once been the person who knew his favorite coffee order, the one who could read his mood before he said a single word. Now she stood in hospital scrubs beneath sterile white light, speaking to him with the quiet formality reserved for patients and their families. Ethan cleared his throat gently, the sound breaking the silence between them. "Can I see her?" he asked. Claire nodded once. "The doctors are finishing an evaluation. It should only be a few minutes." Her voice was steady, controlled, and carefully neutral, yet something in her eyes shifted for the briefest second before she looked back down at the chart. Ethan rested one hand on the cool metal railing along the wall, trying to steady the rush of thoughts moving through his mind. He had spent years building Parker Holdings into one of the most influential investment firms in the Northeast. Boardrooms, negotiations, acquisitions, those were the places where he understood the rules. But this hallway was different. Here, time slowed down, and money meant nothing against the quiet uncertainty behind those glass ICU doors. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The distant sound of a monitor echoed faintly from inside the unit. Claire finally closed the chart and placed it gently against the counter near the nursing station. "She responded well to the initial treatment," she said softly. "The cardiology team is optimistic about her recovery, but the next 24 hours will be important." Ethan nodded slowly. The information was clear, professional, exactly what a hospital coordinator should say. Yet every sentence felt strangely surreal because it was Claire speaking. Claire, who had once sat across from him in a small coffee shop near Boston Harbor almost 10 years earlier, laughing over a spilled cup of hot chocolate on a snowy afternoon. The memory arrived without warning, vivid and warm against the sterile brightness of the hospital corridor. Back then they had been younger, both chasing futures that seemed uncertain but exciting. Ethan had just finished graduate school, still trying to prove himself in his father's demanding business world. Claire had been studying nursing, determined to build a career where she could help people in ways that felt real and meaningful. Their lives had intersected in the simplest way possible, two strangers reaching for the same book in a quiet library reading room. He remembered how surprised he had been when she laughed instead of apologizing. That laugh had followed him for years afterward, even when the rest of the memories became harder to hold. Ethan glanced toward the ICU doors again, then back to Claire. "How long have you been working here?" he asked quietly. Claire folded her arms gently, maintaining a respectful distance between them. "Almost 4 years." The answer was short, but it carried the quiet confidence of someone who had found a place where she belonged. Ethan nodded again, absorbing that detail like another small piece of a puzzle he had not realized he was still trying to solve. "For years," which meant she had been here long before tonight. Long before the phone call that brought him rushing across the city. For years their worlds had existed only a few miles apart, without ever crossing. The thought settled heavily in his chest. Claire seemed to sense the direction of his thoughts, because she spoke again before the silence could stretch too far. "The doctor will come speak with you shortly," she said. Her tone was gentle now, almost familiar, though the professionalism never fully faded. Ethan studied her for a moment longer. Time had changed many things about Claire Bennett. Her expression carried a quiet maturity that had not been there when they were younger, and the confidence in her voice suggested someone who had spent years guiding people through difficult nights exactly like this one. But one thing had not changed. The way her eyes held a calm strength even in uncertain moments. It was the same look that had once convinced him that the future, no matter how complicated, would somehow work itself out. Ethan exhaled slowly, unaware that he had been holding his breath. The hospital remained quiet around them, monitors humming softly behind the ICU doors while the city outside continued sleeping beneath the early morning sky. And standing there in the silent corridor, Ethan realized something he had not expected when he walked into the building that night. The past he thought had ended years ago had just stepped back into his life under the bright white lights of Westbridge Medical Center. The quiet hum of the intensive care unit continued behind the glass doors, a steady rhythm that seemed to slow time itself. Ethan Parker stood near the wall, beside the nurse's station, his gaze drifting across the corridor as though he were seeing the place for the first time. The fluorescent lights cast long reflections across the polished floor, and somewhere farther down the hall a rolling cart moved quietly past, its wheels barely making a sound. Hospitals had always felt strange to Ethan, places where the outside world paused while something far more important unfolded inside. Yet tonight the strangeness came from something else entirely. Claire Bennett was standing only a few steps away. The realization had still not settled completely in his mind. For years he had convinced himself that the chapter of his life that included her had closed for good, sealed away by time, and unanswered questions. Yet here she was, as real and composed as ever, adjusting the sleeve of her scrub top while she reviewed a digital tablet at the nursing station. Ethan studied her quietly, noticing details he might not have seen before. There was a calm efficiency in the way she moved, a quiet confidence that suggested years of experience guiding worried families through nights exactly like this one. The young woman he remembered had been passionate and determined, but there had also been a softness to her then, a hopeful energy that believed every problem could eventually find a solution. The woman standing in front of him now still carried that same strength, but it had been shaped by something deeper. Experience, perhaps, responsibility, or simply the passage of time. Ethan shifted slightly, resting his hands in the pockets of his coat. The air inside the corridor felt cool, and the distant sound of another heart monitor echoed faintly through the hallway. For a moment he considered speaking again, but the words that came to mind felt strangely inadequate. What did someone say to a person they had once loved deeply but had not seen in nearly a decade? Before he could decide, the ICU doors opened and a doctor stepped out, removing a pair of light blue gloves and placing them in a nearby bin. Claire turned immediately, her professional focus returning with practiced ease. "Dr. Reynolds," she said. "This is Ethan Parker, Mrs. Parker's son." The physician nodded politely and approached Ethan with a reassuring expression. "Your mother is resting now," he explained. The episode earlier tonight was concerning, but the medical team responded quickly. At this point, we are optimistic about her condition. Ethan listened carefully, absorbing each word with the attention of someone who rarely allowed uncertainty into his life. He asked a few quiet questions, and the doctor answered them with steady clarity before excusing himself to return inside the unit. When the conversation ended, the hallway grew quiet again. Claire remained near the desk, her posture relaxed but attentive as she entered a few notes into the tablet. Ethan hesitated for a moment before stepping closer. "Thank you," he said softly. Claire looked up, meeting his eyes with a calm expression. "You do not need to thank me," she replied gently. "It is my job." The answer was simple, but Ethan noticed the faint warmth behind the words. He studied her face for a second longer, noticing how familiar and unfamiliar it felt at the same time. Years ago, he had known exactly what she would say in almost any situation. Now, every sentence carried a quiet distance between them. Ethan glanced toward the glass doors again, imagining his mother resting inside the quiet ICU room. When he looked back at Claire, something unexpected surfaced in his voice. "I never imagined seeing you here." Claire held his gaze for a moment, and the stillness between them seemed to stretch across the corridor. Then she gave a small, thoughtful nod. "Neither did I." Her voice was calm, but there was something deeper beneath it, something that suggested the past had not faded as completely as either of them might have believed. Ethan felt a quiet weight settle in his chest. For years he had wondered what might have happened if certain conversations had taken place differently, if certain nights had ended with answers instead of silence. Now fate had placed them together again under the bright lights of a hospital corridor at 2 in the morning. Outside the building, the city of Boston continued sleeping beneath the early morning sky, unaware that two people who once shared a life had just crossed paths again in the most unexpected place imaginable. And as Ethan stood there listening to the distant rhythm of the monitors inside the intensive care unit, he realized that the past he thought had been left behind was quietly beginning to unfold again. The hallway outside the intensive care unit slowly settled into a quieter rhythm as the night continued moving toward morning. A wall clock above the nurse's station showed 3:15, its second hand ticking steadily through the silence. Ethan Parker had moved to one of the chairs near the glass doors, though he had not truly sat down to rest. His posture remained alert, shoulders slightly forward, his attention drifting between the ICU entrance and the steady activity of the medical staff around him. For a man who spent most of his life in fast-paced boardrooms and airports, the stillness of the hospital felt unfamiliar. Here there were no presentations, no financial projections, no strategies that could speed up time. Recovery followed its own pace, measured not in minutes, but in patience. Claire Bennett stood a few steps away at the nurse's station, reviewing patient notes with the quiet focus of someone accustomed to long overnight shifts. The soft glow of the computer screen illuminated her face, while the distant sound of a heart monitor continued its steady rhythm inside the unit. Every movement she made seemed deliberate and calm, from the way she typed a brief note into the system to the way she adjusted a small stack of charts beside the keyboard. Ethan found himself watching her again, though he quickly reminded himself that this was not the same life they had once shared. Years had passed since the last time they spoke outside a crowded sidewalk on a rainy evening that had ended with more silence than explanation. He had built an empire since then, expanded Parker Holdings into a company whose decisions influenced industries across the Northeast. Yet standing here tonight, none of that history felt relevant compared to the quiet presence of the woman across the hallway. Claire finished entering the information and gently closed the tablet, placing it beside the station computer. She glanced toward the ICU doors, then back toward Ethan. For a moment it seemed as if she was deciding whether to say something. Finally, she walked over with the same steady composure she had shown all night. "The nurses will continue monitoring her heart rhythm through the early morning," she explained calmly. "If everything remains stable, the cardiology team will reassess her condition after sunrise." Ethan nodded, appreciating the clarity in her voice. "I understand." Claire rested her hands lightly at her sides, her posture relaxed but attentive. "You are welcome to see her briefly if you would like." She added, "The nurses can guide you in for a few minutes." Ethan stood slowly from the chair, adjusting the sleeve of his coat as he approached the glass doors. Before he stepped inside, however, he paused and looked back at Claire. The bright corridor lights reflected softly across the floor between them, creating a quiet moment that neither of them seemed eager to rush. "You seem exactly the same," Ethan said quietly. Claire tilted her head slightly, a faint smile touching her expression for the first time that night. "People usually say the opposite after 10 years, she replied. Ethan allowed himself a small breath of amusement, though the emotion behind it carried something deeper. "Maybe I meant the part that matters," he said. Claire held his gaze for a moment longer, and the calm professionalism she carried all evening softened just slightly. "Hospitals have a way of reminding people what really matters," she answered gently. The distant sound of footsteps echoed briefly from the far end of the corridor as another nurse passed by pushing a small medical cart. Ethan looked back toward the ICU entrance again, then toward Claire. "Thank you for being here tonight," he said. Claire gave a small nod, the same quiet strength returning to her expression. "I am glad I could help." Ethan stepped through the glass doors and disappeared briefly inside the intensive care unit, leaving Claire alone in the corridor once again. She remained still for a moment, watching the door close behind him. The fluorescent lights hummed softly above her while the hospital continued its steady overnight rhythm. After a few seconds, she turned back toward the nurse's station, yet something thoughtful lingered in her eyes. For years she had believed that the past was a chapter that had ended without warning, a memory that belonged to another life entirely. Yet fate had a way of rearranging even the most carefully organized plans. And tonight, in the quiet hours before dawn, two people who once walked the same path had found themselves standing in the same hallway again, separated by time, but connected by a story neither of them had ever truly finished. The quiet rhythm of the hospital continued long after Ethan Parker stepped through the glass doors of the intensive care unit. Inside, the lights were softer, the air cooler, and every sound seemed more deliberate. Machines monitored each heartbeat with patient precision while nurses moved calmly between rooms, checking screens and adjusting equipment with practiced care. Ethan followed a nurse down a short corridor before stopping beside a private ICU room where his mother rested. The nurse spoke softly, explaining that the visit would be brief, and Ethan nodded with quiet understanding. When he stepped inside the room, he felt a wave of relief settle slowly over him. His mother lay resting peacefully beneath the light hospital blanket, the steady beeping of the heart monitor confirming that her condition was stable for now. Ethan pulled a chair closer to the bedside and sat down carefully. For a moment, he simply watched the rise and fall of her breathing. In the world outside these walls, he was known for calm decisions and unwavering confidence. But sitting beside the hospital bed reminded him that some parts of life were never fully within anyone's control. After several quiet minutes, he gently reached for his mother's hand. The contact was warm and reassuring. "You gave everyone quite a scare tonight," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. His mother did not wake, but the steady rhythm of the monitor remained unchanged. Ethan allowed himself a small breath of relief before standing again. The nurse signaled politely that it was time to step out so the staff could continue their monitoring. Ethan thanked her and quietly exited the room, moving back into the brighter corridor outside the ICU. Claire Bennett was still near the nurse's station when he returned, reviewing another set of notes on the tablet. She glanced up briefly as the doors closed behind him. "She is resting comfortably," Ethan said. Claire nodded gently, as though she had expected that answer. "That is good to hear." For a moment the two of them stood in the same quiet space once again. The early morning hours had begun to approach, and the faint blue light of dawn could just barely be seen through the tall windows at the end of the hallway. Ethan leaned lightly against the wall beside the station, looking down the corridor as if searching for the right words. "You have been doing this for a long time," he said thoughtfully. Claire followed his gaze down the hall. "Long enough to know that nights like this can change people," she replied. Ethan considered that quietly. "In what way?" Claire folded her arms gently, her expression thoughtful rather than distant. "When someone they care about is lying in a hospital room, people tend to see things differently," she said. "Priorities become clearer." Ethan gave a small nod. He understood exactly what she meant, though hearing it from Claire carried a deeper meaning. After a moment of silence, he spoke again. "I never asked earlier," he said carefully. "Why this hospital?" Claire rested her hands on the edge of the desk, her posture relaxed but steady. "Because this is where I wanted to be," she answered. "The work here matters." Ethan studied her expression, recognizing the quiet determination behind her words. Years ago, that same determination had driven her through long nights studying and volunteering at clinics, while most of their friends chased easier paths. "You always said helping people made the difficult days worth it," Ethan said softly. Claire looked at him with mild surprise, as though she had not expected him to remember something so small after all these years. "I suppose some things stay the same," she said gently. Ethan allowed himself a faint smile, though it carried a hint of nostalgia. The hallway grew quieter as the night shift prepared for the gradual arrival of morning staff. A nurse passed by pushing a cart filled with fresh supplies, offering Claire a quick greeting before continuing down the corridor. Ethan glanced toward the ICU doors again before turning back to Claire. "I will be here most of the day," he said. Claire nodded. "That is completely fine. The medical team will keep you updated." Another quiet moment passed between them, but this one felt different, less uncertain, more familiar. And as the first pale light of dawn slowly reached the windows at the end of the hallway, both of them understood that the night that brought them back into the same place had only just begun to reveal what the coming days might hold. Morning arrived slowly inside Westbridge Medical Center, not with sunlight pouring through windows, but with the subtle change of rhythm that happens when the night shift begins handing responsibilities to the daytime staff. The corridor outside the intensive care unit gradually filled with quiet footsteps and low voices as nurses exchanged updates and doctors reviewed patient charts. Ethan Parker remained seated near the glass doors, a paper cup of coffee resting in his hands, even though he had barely taken a sip. The hours since dawn had passed in a strange blur of conversations with physicians, brief visits to his mother's bedside, and long stretches of waiting in the hallway where everything seemed to move both slowly and all at once. His mother's condition remained stable, the doctors explained, which was the best news they could offer this early in the recovery process. For Ethan, that small measure of reassurance was enough to keep the tension in his chest from tightening further. Claire Bennett had been moving steadily between patients and staff since the shift change began, her calm presence guiding conversations with families and coordinating updates from the medical teams. Watching her work reminded Ethan of something he had always admired about her years ago. Claire had a quiet ability to bring order into difficult moments. While others reacted emotionally to uncertainty, she moved carefully through it, offering clarity and reassurance without raising her voice or drawing attention to herself. Late in the morning, she finally stepped away from the nurse's station for a moment and approached where Ethan Saturday, the cardiology team, just finished another evaluation. She said gently, "Your mother's heart rhythm has remained consistent through the night, which is a very positive sign." Ethan looked up from the untouched coffee cup and allowed himself a small breath of relief. "That is good to hear," he replied. Claire nodded and leaned lightly against the counter beside him. glancing briefly toward the ICU doors before continuing. If everything continues to improve, they may move her out of intensive care tomorrow. Ethan considered the information carefully. For someone used to making decisions measured in millions of dollars, the possibility of a simple step, like moving a hospital patient to another floor, felt surprisingly meaningful. "She will like that," he said quietly. Claire offered a faint smile. "Most patients do." A few seconds passed before Ethan spoke again. "You have handled everything very well," he said sincerely. "I appreciate it." Claire seemed slightly uncomfortable with the compliment and shook her head gently. "It is simply part of the job." Ethan studied her expression for a moment. The modesty was familiar. Claire had always been uncomfortable accepting praise, even when she had clearly earned it. He leaned forward slightly, resting his forearms on his knees. "Still," he said calmly, "I meant what I said." Claire looked at him for a moment longer before changing the subject in a quiet, practical way. "Have you eaten anything this morning?" Ethan let out a small breath of amusement at the question. "Not yet." Claire gestured down the corridor toward a nearby elevator. "There is a cafeteria on the first floor. It is nothing fancy, but it is open all day." Ethan followed her gesture, then looked back at her with a thoughtful expression. "You always did remind people to take care of themselves," he said. Claire paused slightly at the comment, as though the memory had caught her by surprise. For a brief moment the professional distance between them softened. "Someone has to," she replied quietly. The hospital corridor continued its steady daytime pace around them. A doctor walked by reviewing a tablet, while two nurses discussed medication schedules near the station. Life inside the medical center moved forward with constant quiet urgency. Ethan rose from the chair and glanced once more toward the ICU doors before turning back to Claire. "Maybe I will take your advice," he said. Claire nodded approvingly. "That would be wise." As Ethan walked toward the elevators, he felt something unusual settle into his thoughts. The long years between him and Claire had created distance, but they had not erased the quiet understanding that once existed between them. And as the elevator doors closed, carrying him down toward the hospital cafeteria, Ethan realized that the unexpected reunion from the night before was beginning to unfold into something neither of them had planned. The elevator doors opened quietly onto the first floor of Westbridge Medical Center, and Ethan Parker stepped into a much brighter part of the building than the quiet corridor he had left behind. The hospital cafeteria was already busy with late morning activity. Nurses in light blue scrubs gathered around small tables between shifts. Doctors stood near the coffee station reviewing patient charts, and families spoke in low voices while waiting for updates from upstairs. The smell of fresh coffee and warm food filled the air, a comforting contrast to the sterile scent of antiseptic that dominated the upper floors. Ethan moved slowly toward the serving counter, scanning the options with little real interest. He had not realized how tired he was until now. The long night, the rush to the hospital, and the emotional shock of seeing Claire again had left his mind working harder than usual. He ordered a simple breakfast and carried the tray to a small table near the window where the late morning sunlight filtered softly through the glass. For a few minutes he simply sat there, staring at the cup of coffee in front of him while his thoughts moved in quiet circles. The last time he had seen Claire Bennett before last night had been almost 10 years earlier on a rainy Boston evening. They had stood on opposite sides of a crowded sidewalk while the city lights reflected across the wet pavement. Their conversation that night had been brief and unfinished, filled with words neither of them truly meant and questions neither of them answered. After that evening, Claire had disappeared from his life completely. Ethan had searched for her at first, calling old friends and visiting places where they used to spend time together, but every path eventually led nowhere. Eventually, the responsibilities of building Parker Holdings demanded his full attention, and the unanswered questions became something he carried quietly rather than something he chased. Yet sitting in the hospital cafeteria now, Ethan realized how easily the past had returned the moment he saw her standing under the white lights of the ICU hallway. The memory of that moment remained vivid. The calm expression on her face, the professional tone of her voice, and the brief flicker of surprise in her eyes before she regained her composure. It had felt like opening a door he had once believed was permanently closed. Ethan took a sip of coffee and looked out the window at the busy Boston street below. Cars moved steadily along the avenue while pedestrians crossed the sidewalks carrying briefcases and shopping bags. Life outside the hospital continued exactly as it had the day before, unaware that inside the building two people with a complicated history had unexpectedly crossed paths again. After finishing the small breakfast, he returned the tray and made his way back toward the elevators. The ride to the intensive care floor felt shorter this time, though the quiet anticipation in his thoughts had not changed. When the elevator doors opened, the familiar corridor greeted him once again with its soft lighting and steady rhythm of activity. Claire Bennett was speaking with a doctor near the nurse's station when Ethan stepped out. She listened attentively, as the physician explained something on a digital tablet, then nodded before the doctor continued down the hallway. Claire turned and noticed Ethan approaching. For a moment the professional calm returned to her expression, but there was also a trace of something warmer now that the morning had passed. "Did you manage to find breakfast?" she asked. Ethan nodded lightly. "I did. You were right. It helped." Claire seemed satisfied with the answer and gestured toward the ICU doors. "Your mother is still resting comfortably," she said. Ethan leaned gently against the counter near the nurse's station, feeling more at ease than he had earlier in the night. "Thank you for keeping an eye on everything," he said sincerely. Claire hesitated for a moment, then spoke in a softer voice. "Your mother asked about you earlier," she said. Ethan looked up with mild surprise. "She was awake?" Claire nodded gently. "Only for a short time. She asked if you had arrived yet." Ethan felt a quiet warmth in his chest at the news. "I am glad she knows I am here." Claire studied him for a moment, as though she were considering whether to say something more. Then she gave a small, thoughtful smile. "She also mentioned that she remembers me." Ethan raised an eyebrow slightly. "That does not surprise me." Claire looked down briefly, then back toward him. "She said something interesting," she added calmly. Ethan waited. Claire met his gaze again, her voice steady but reflective. "She said she always wondered if the two of us would meet again someday." For a moment neither of them spoke. The quiet sounds of the hospital corridor continued around them, but the simple words seemed to settle gently in the space between them. And as Ethan considered what Claire had just said, he began to realize that perhaps their unexpected reunion had been waiting to happen far longer than either of them had understood. Claire's words lingered quietly in the hallway long after she finished speaking. Ethan Parker remained leaning against the counter beside the nurse's station, absorbing the simple statement his mother had apparently made. "She always wondered if the two of us would meet again someday." The sentence seemed to echo softly in his thoughts. For years he had believed that the story between him and Claire Bennett had ended without warning, sealed off by circumstances neither of them fully understood at the time. Yet hearing that his mother remembered Claire so clearly made something inside him shift slightly. It reminded him that the past he carried privately had also been visible to the people closest to him. Claire appeared to sense the weight of the moment as well. She gently straightened a stack of charts on the desk, her movements careful and measured, as though giving both of them a moment to process what had just been said. The hospital corridor continued its steady pace around them. A nurse passed by carrying fresh linens, and somewhere down the hall a quiet conversation between doctors drifted through the air. Finally Ethan spoke again, his voice calm but thoughtful. "My mother always liked you," he said. Claire gave a small nod, her expression softening slightly at the memory. "She was always very kind to me." Ethan allowed himself a faint smile. "She probably still remembers the night you helped her reorganize the entire kitchen pantry." Claire laughed softly, the sound gentle and genuine, a brief return of the warmth that had once been so familiar between them. "Your mother insisted the spice jars had to be arranged alphabetically," she said. "I remember thinking that was the most serious task anyone had ever given me." Ethan chuckled quietly, shaking his head at the memory. For a moment the sterile hospital hallway seemed less distant, replaced by the comfortable image of his childhood home years earlier. Claire's expression slowly returned to its calm professionalism, though the warmth in her eyes remained. "She also asked me something else this morning," Claire said carefully. Ethan raised an eyebrow with mild curiosity. "What did she ask?" Claire hesitated briefly before answering. "She asked if we had spoken yet." Ethan felt a quiet shift in his thoughts. "And what did you tell her?" Claire looked down at the desk for a second before meeting his gaze again. "I told her we had." Ethan nodded slowly, understanding more than the words themselves. His mother had always been perceptive, often noticing emotional details others missed entirely. The idea that she might already sense the complicated history between him and Claire did not surprise him. The hallway remained peaceful, though the late morning activity had grown slightly busier as hospital staff continued their rounds. Ethan glanced once more toward the ICU doors where his mother rested before turning back to Claire. "There were a lot of things we never finished talking about," he said quietly. Claire held his gaze, her expression thoughtful but steady. "Yes," she replied. Ethan took a slow breath, aware that this conversation was stepping into territory neither of them had approached in years. "I used to wonder why you left so suddenly," he admitted. The words were not accusatory, only honest. Claire listened carefully, her posture relaxed but attentive. The silence between them stretched gently for a moment before she answered. "Sometimes people believe they are doing the right thing, even when it hurts," she said softly. Ethan studied her expression, sensing that her answer carried more meaning than the sentence itself revealed. "That sounds like something you have thought about for a long time," he replied. Claire gave a faint nod. "Some decisions stay with you." Ethan felt the quiet truth of those words settle into the air between them. For years he had believed that unanswered questions were simply part of life. Yet standing here now, speaking with Claire again after so much time had passed, he began to realize that the story between them had never truly reached its ending. And as the bright hospital lights reflected across the polished floor of the corridor, both of them understood that the past they once walked away from was slowly finding its voice again. Claire's quiet answer remained suspended in Ethan Parker's thoughts long after the conversation paused. "Some decisions stay with you." The words carried a calm honesty that did not ask for sympathy or explanation, yet they revealed something deeper than either of them had spoken aloud before. Ethan remained standing beside the nurse's station, his gaze drifting toward the large windows at the end of the corridor where late morning light now filled the hallway with a softer glow. The hospital had grown busier as the day continued. Doctors moved between patient rooms with quiet urgency, and nurses checked charts while speaking gently with waiting families. Yet despite the movement around them, the moment between Ethan and Claire felt strangely still, as though the past had briefly stepped forward to stand beside them again. Ethan finally broke the silence, his voice thoughtful rather than confrontational. "You always believed in doing what you thought was right," he said. Claire met his eyes, understanding the meaning behind the statement. "I still try to," she replied softly. Ethan nodded, though the quiet question in his expression remained, even when it meant walking away without saying goodbye. The words were calm, but carried years of uncertainty within them. Claire did not look away. Instead, she took a slow breath before answering. Especially then. Ethan felt the honesty in her reply settle heavily in the air between them. For years he had imagined dozens of explanations for why Claire had disappeared from his life so suddenly. Some had been angry, others hopeful, but none had truly answered the question that lingered after all this time. Claire rested her hands lightly against the counter beside her, her posture composed but reflective. "Your world was changing very quickly back then," she said carefully. "Your father had just stepped down from the company. Investors were watching every decision you made, and Parker Holdings was growing faster than anyone expected." Ethan listened quietly, recognizing the accuracy of her words. Those years had been filled with pressure and responsibility he had not always been prepared to carry. Claire continued gently. "I knew how important that moment was for your future." Ethan studied her expression, sensing that the explanation was moving towards something deeper. "You were part of that future," he said quietly. Claire gave a faint shake of her head. "I was part of your life," she corrected softly. "But your future belonged to something much larger." Ethan frowned slightly, the old confusion beginning to return. "That does not explain why you left without telling me." Claire hesitated for a moment, her eyes briefly lowering to the floor before she looked back up again. "Because I believed it would make things easier for you," she said. Ethan's expression shifted with quiet disbelief. "Easier?" Claire nodded gently. "If I stayed, you would have tried to balance everything. Your company, your family expectations, and our relationship. You would have carried all of it alone." Ethan absorbed her words slowly. For years he had interpreted her absence as abandonment. Yet hearing her explanation now revealed a different possibility. Claire had not left because she cared less. She had left because she believed it would remove a burden from his shoulders during the most important years of his career. Claire spoke again, her voice calm but sincere. I thought you deserved the freedom to build your life without having to choose between two paths. Ethan looked down briefly, processing the weight of that decision. You never gave me the chance to make that choice myself, he said quietly. Claire did not argue with him. Instead, she gave a small, thoughtful nod. That may be true. The hospital corridor continued moving around them, but the conversation had shifted something deeper beneath the surface. Years of unanswered questions were slowly finding their place in the open air between them. Ethan finally lifted his gaze again, meeting Claire's eyes with a mixture of understanding and lingering emotion. You believed leaving would help me, he said. Claire held his gaze calmly. Yes. Ethan exhaled slowly, the quiet tension in his chest easing slightly for the first time since their reunion. The explanation did not erase the years of distance between them, but it offered something he had not expected when he walked into the hospital the night before. It offered clarity. And standing there in the bright corridor of Westbridge Medical Center, Ethan realized that the story he thought had ended years ago was slowly revealing truths neither of them had been ready to face until now. The explanation Claire had given remained quietly present in Ethan Parker's thoughts long after their conversation slowed to a pause. The bright corridor of Westbridge Medical Center continued its steady movement around them, yet the space between them felt more personal now, as if the years that once separated them had become something they were finally beginning to understand. Ethan rested his hand lightly against the counter beside the nurse's station, his gaze thoughtful rather than distant. For a long time he had believed that Claire's sudden departure had been a choice made without him in mind. Hearing her explanation had shifted that belief in ways he had not expected. It did not erase the years they had spent apart, but it revealed the quiet intention behind a decision he once thought was abandonment. Claire remained calm beside him, though there was a reflective softness in her expression that had not been there earlier in the morning. She seemed to be considering whether the conversation should continue or if the moment had already said enough. Ethan finally spoke again, his voice steady. Those years were difficult, he admitted, but they were also important. The company needed stability, and I had to grow into responsibilities I had never planned for. Claire nodded gently. I remember. Ethan studied her expression with mild curiosity. You followed the news? Claire allowed a small, modest smile. It was difficult not to. Parker Holdings became one of the fastest-growing investment firms in the region. Ethan exhaled quietly, acknowledging the truth in her words. Success often looks simple from the outside, he said thoughtfully, but the reality is usually more complicated. Claire seemed to understand that sentiment well. Most things worth building are. For a moment their conversation returned to the comfortable rhythm of two people who once knew each other deeply. The past still existed between them, but it no longer felt like an unsolved puzzle. Instead it felt like a chapter that had simply paused before reaching its final pages. The ICU doors opened softly again, and one of the cardiologists stepped into the hallway with a reassuring expression. Claire greeted the physician calmly and listened while he explained that Ethan's mother had shown further signs of improvement. Her blood pressure had stabilized, and the medical team believed she could be moved to a private recovery room later that afternoon. Ethan listened carefully to every detail, the quiet relief in his posture growing stronger with each sentence. When the doctor finished speaking and continued down the hallway, Ethan turned back toward Claire. That is the best news I have heard all day, he said. Claire smiled gently. Your mother is very strong. Ethan nodded. She has always been. He glanced toward the ICU doors again before looking back at Claire. She will be glad to see you when she wakes again. Claire seemed slightly surprised by the comment. I would be happy to say hello if she asks. Ethan studied her expression carefully, noticing the same humility she had always carried. She will ask, he said with quiet certainty. The hallway had grown brighter as midday sunlight filtered through the large windows near the end of the corridor. The busy rhythm of the hospital continued around them, yet Ethan sensed something calmer beneath the surface of the moment. For the first time since arriving at Westbridge Medical Center the night before, he no longer felt as though the past and present were pulling in opposite directions. Claire had offered him an explanation he never expected to hear, and that honesty had quietly reshaped the way he understood the years they had spent apart. Ethan took a slow breath before speaking again. You know, he said thoughtfully, life has a strange way of bringing people back into the same place when they least expect it. Claire considered the comment before answering. Hospitals tend to do that. Ethan smiled faintly at her response. Maybe that is true. The steady sounds of the medical center continued around them, while both of them stood in the corridor, reflecting on the unexpected path that had brought them together again. And as Ethan looked at Claire standing beneath the bright lights of the nurse's station, he realized that the future he once believed had moved far beyond their shared past might still hold more possibilities than either of them had imagined. By early afternoon, the atmosphere inside Westbridge Medical Center had shifted again. The bright midday sunlight poured through the tall windows at the end of the corridor, reflecting softly across the polished floor, while the steady rhythm of hospital life continued around the intensive care unit. Nurses moved in and out of patient rooms carrying charts and medical supplies, and the quiet conversations between physicians created a calm background hum that filled the hallway. Ethan Parker stood near the ICU doors once more, reviewing a short message on his phone before slipping it back into his coat pocket. For the first time since arriving the night before, his posture carried a sense of calm rather than tension. The news about his mother's improving condition had settled into a quiet reassurance that allowed him to breathe a little easier. Claire Bennett approached from the nurse's station holding a tablet, her expression composed but relaxed. "The transfer team is preparing the recovery room now," she explained gently. "Your mother will be moved upstairs within the next hour." Ethan nodded appreciatively. "She will be glad to hear that." Claire smiled faintly. Most patients feel the same way about leaving intensive care. The two of them stood together near the window as a brief silence passed. Outside, Boston's afternoon traffic moved steadily along the nearby avenue while the city continued its busy rhythm far beyond the hospital walls. Ethan rested his hands lightly in his coat pockets, watching the activity below for a moment before speaking again. "I have been thinking about what you said earlier," he admitted quietly. Claire glanced at him with mild curiosity. "About the past?" Ethan nodded. "About why you believed leaving was the right thing to do." Claire listened without interrupting, her expression thoughtful but calm. Ethan continued carefully. "For a long time I believed you had simply decided to move on with your life." Claire remained silent for a moment before answering. "It was never that simple." Ethan met her gaze with quiet honesty. "I see that now." The words were not dramatic, but they carried the weight of understanding that had taken years to reach. Claire seemed to recognize that as well. She gave a small nod, acknowledging the shift in perspective without needing to say more. The ICU doors opened again as a nurse stepped out with a clipboard. "Mr. Parker," she said politely, "your mother is awake and asking for you." Ethan immediately straightened. "Thank you," he replied. Claire gestured toward the door with a supportive smile. "You should go in." Ethan paused briefly before stepping forward. "Would you mind coming with me?" he asked. Claire looked slightly surprised by the request. "Are you sure?" Ethan nodded. "My mother would like that." Claire considered the invitation for a moment before agreeing quietly. Together they walked through the glass doors and into the quiet ICU corridor. Inside the room, Ethan's mother lay comfortably against the raised pillows of the hospital bed, her expression brighter than it had been earlier that morning. When she saw Ethan enter, her face softened with relief. "There you are," she said gently. Ethan moved to the bedside and took her hand. "I am right here." After a moment, she noticed Claire standing near the door. Her eyes widened slightly with recognition before a warm smile appeared. "Claire Bennett," she said softly. Claire stepped closer, her professional calm giving way to a sincere warmth. "It is good to see you again, Mrs. Parker." Ethan's mother looked between the two of them with a knowing expression that carried both affection and quiet wisdom. "I had a feeling life might bring the two of you into the same room again someday," she said gently. Ethan and Claire exchanged a brief glance, both aware that the unexpected reunion unfolding in that hospital room had already begun to change the course of their story in ways neither of them could have predicted. Mrs. Parker's warm smile lingered in the quiet hospital room as the afternoon light filtered gently through the window beside her bed. The steady rhythm of the heart monitor continued its calm pattern while nurses moved softly through the corridor outside. Ethan Parker remained seated beside his mother, his hand resting lightly over hers as the tension of the previous night slowly faded into something calmer. Claire Bennett stood near the foot of the bed, her posture relaxed but attentive, The professional confidence she carried blending naturally with the familiarity of someone who had once spent time in this family's home many years earlier. Mrs. Parker looked between them again, her eyes thoughtful in a way that suggested she understood far more than either of them had said aloud. "Life has an interesting sense of timing," she said gently. Ethan gave a quiet smile. "You always believe that?" Mrs. Parker nodded softly. "Because it is usually true." She shifted slightly against the pillows, careful not to disturb the monitoring equipment attached to her arm. "Claire, I am very glad you were here when Ethan arrived last night," she added kindly. Claire gave a small, respectful nod. "I am glad I could help." Mrs. Parker studied her for a moment with the same perceptive expression that Ethan remembered from childhood. "You always had a steady way about you," she said. "That is a rare quality." Claire seemed slightly embarrassed by the compliment, but accepted it with quiet gratitude. Ethan watched the exchange with a thoughtful expression. For the first time since their unexpected reunion, he noticed how naturally Claire seemed to fit into the room again, as if the years between them had not completely erased the connections that once existed. The conversation drifted gently for a few minutes as Mrs. Parker asked a few simple questions about the hospital staff and the plan for her recovery room upstairs. Claire answered each one calmly, explaining that the cardiology team was confident about her progress and that the transfer would happen soon. Eventually, a nurse stepped into the room to prepare the equipment for the move. Ethan stood to give the staff space to work, and Claire quietly moved toward the door. Mrs. Parker watched them both for a moment before speaking again. "Ethan," she said softly. He turned back toward her. "Yes." She glanced toward Claire, then back to him with a knowing smile. "Do not wait another 10 years to finish a conversation that matters." Ethan chuckled gently, though the message behind the words was clear. "I will remember that." Claire gave Mrs. Parker a warm smile before stepping into the hallway. Ethan followed a moment later once the nurse finished adjusting the monitors. The corridor outside felt calmer now that the afternoon had settled across the hospital. Claire leaned lightly against the wall beside the door while Ethan stepped beside her. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The quiet atmosphere carried the same thoughtful energy that had followed them since the night before. Ethan finally broke the silence. "My mother has always been very direct." Claire smiled softly. "That is one way to describe it." Ethan glanced toward the window where the sunlight reflected across the polished floor. "She usually says things people need to hear." Claire considered that before responding. "Sometimes the right moment simply arrives." Ethan looked back at her, the weight of the past no longer as heavy as it had been earlier in the day. "Maybe that moment is now," he said quietly. Claire held his gaze, thoughtful but calm. The hospital corridor continued its steady rhythm around them, yet the conversation waiting between them felt more important than the passing hours. And as the afternoon sunlight slowly filled the hallway, both of them understood that the unfinished story they once left behind was finally beginning to move forward again. The late afternoon light stretched quietly across the hallway outside the recovery wing as the transfer team carefully moved Mrs. Parker's hospital bed from the intensive care unit to her new room upstairs. The process was calm and efficient, with nurses guiding the equipment while a doctor monitored her condition. Ethan Parker walked beside the bed the entire way, his presence steady and reassuring as his mother rested comfortably beneath the light blanket. Claire Bennett followed a few steps behind, observing with the professional attention that had guided her through countless patient transitions over the years. When they reached the private recovery room, the nurses positioned the bed near the window where soft sunlight filled the space with a warmer atmosphere than the clinical brightness of the ICU floor. After the monitors were connected and the staff confirmed that everything was stable, the team quietly stepped out, leaving Ethan and Claire standing near the door while Mrs. Parker rested peacefully. The room felt calm, almost serene, with the distant sounds of the hospital softened by the closed door. Ethan walked slowly toward the window, glancing out at the city skyline stretching across Boston's late afternoon horizon. For a moment, he simply stood there, reflecting on how quickly the events of the past 24 hours had changed everything. Just the night before, he had rushed into this building worried about his mother's health and expecting nothing more than a long night of waiting. Instead, he had found himself standing face to face with someone he once believed had disappeared from his life forever. Claire remained near the door, watching the quiet room with the same composed calm that had guided her throughout the entire day. Eventually Ethan turned back toward her. "Thank you for everything you did today," he said sincerely. Claire gave a small smile. "Your mother did most of the hard work herself." Ethan stepped closer, the space between them no longer carrying the uncertainty that had filled the corridor the night before. "Still," he said gently, "you were here when it mattered." Claire looked at him thoughtfully. "That is what this work is about." For a moment the room grew quiet again, except for the soft rhythm of the heart monitor beside the bed. Ethan considered his next words carefully before speaking again. "When we spoke earlier, you said sometimes people believe they are doing the right thing even when it hurts." Claire nodded slowly. "Yes." Ethan met her gaze with calm honesty. "Maybe we both spent too many years believing the past was already decided." Claire studied his expression, sensing the meaning behind his words. "And now?" she asked quietly. Ethan glanced briefly toward the window where the evening light had begun to soften across the skyline before returning his attention to her. "Now I think life sometimes gives people a second chance to finish the conversations they left behind." Claire remained silent for a moment, reflecting on everything that had brought them back to this room. The years apart, the decisions made with good intentions, and the unexpected reunion that began in the quiet hallway outside the intensive care unit. Finally, she spoke with a calm sincerity that matched his own. "Perhaps it does." Ethan allowed a gentle smile to appear. "Would you be willing to have that conversation with me sometime soon?" Claire considered the question carefully before answering. "I think we already started." Ethan laughed softly at the truth in her words. Outside the window, the Boston skyline slowly shifted toward evening, while the hospital continued its steady rhythm of care and recovery. In the quiet recovery room, Mrs. Parker rested peacefully, unaware that the unexpected events of the past day had quietly reopened a chapter of life that both Ethan and Claire once believed had ended long ago. And as the evening light settled gently across the room, the two of them stood together with the understanding that the future was no longer defined only by the choices they made in the past, but also by the new paths they might now choose to walk forward together.